Chapter 6. The Effects of Possession. As I cautioned earlier, it is imperative if you experience a physical problem to consult your family physician. Depossession should not be a substitute for good medical care. Mental problems. A great many mental problems result from intervention by spirits. The most prevalent is lack of concentration, fuzzing out, as one patient puts it. Another said, "My mind takes little breaks, like skipping a spot for a while," and "part shuts off, Blanksville." Memory problems like forgetting something done or said, missing exits on the freeway, etc. are typical. In my practice, I find occasional forgetting of therapy appointments often reflects the spirit's resistance to depossession. This is especially evident when we have been working with recalcitrant entities. The reason forgetting is a problem is that there are two or even more people inhabiting the same body, all doing their own thing from time to time. The possessing spirit may decide he wants ice cream, and the patient comes to with her hand on the freezer door and can't remember why she's opening it. This, of course, depends on how the two are interacting. If one takes over and the other phases out, then that kind of behavior is experienced. In other cases, the thoughts of the spirit's mind are picked up and acted upon by the possessed with no break in consciousness. Some patients remarked that they used to have aptitudes in certain areas like math or spelling, and then were hopeless in them. An extreme example of how spirits interfered in mental functioning is the case of Tony, related in Chapter 7. You'll see how he nearly flunked out of college after a brilliant start. Emotional problems. Emotions are always affected when there is possession. Anxiety, fears, and phobias were traceable in many cases to the possessors, even though patients initially assume responsibility for the reactions. I often heard such comments as, "I always loved driving, but now when I approach the freeway I go bananas," or "I've been looking forward to our session all week, but on the way over I nearly fainted and hardly could restrain myself from walking out of the waiting room. This can't be me." A conversation with the fearful spirits revealed who the anxious ones really were. Phobias frequently are related very logically to the actual circumstances of the former death experience, which the entities vividly remember. When the people they are possessing are in similar situations, all the original fears come back and the possessees, feeling it, assume it's themselves reacting, not realizing they're possessed. This was the case with a particularly sensitive patient, Lynn, a well-known psychic, who couldn't understand what had happened to her. For 7 years, immediately following an elective surgery, she had been unable to drive her car because of feelings of panic. If someone else were driving, she was free of anxiety, unless they drove on the nearby coastal highway, high above the water. This condition was extremely puzzling to her, since one of her former joys in life was racing cars. Under hypnosis, she easily tuned into a young female spirit who, suicidal over a broken romance, had impulsively plunged her car off the same highway. She was terrified as she fell to the ocean far below. Her body was taken to the same hospital that Lynn was in. The spirit, disliking the cold of the morgue and feeling confused and scared, wandered to an upper floor and into Lynn's room, where she soon possessed her. Even when we had been trying to release a frightened entity from a patient who assumed he was possessed, he still found it difficult to experience the panic and disclaim it as not being his own. The more such a patient could believe it belonged to the entity, the better he could quickly bring it under control. Depressions often were traced to despondent spirits who usually didn't realize they were dead. As explained in Chapter 5, some who committed suicide remained bound to the physical world because they were terrified of going to hell. Many continued to be so depressed that they didn't see their spirit helpers and loved ones. Because they were still suicidal, they posed real threats to the very life of the possessed. Regressions to past lives showed that at times these distraught entities had driven their hosts to suicide. Drug and alcohol addiction. Next to depression, the most devastating symptom of spirit possession is drug and alcohol abuse. Once addicted spirits gain entrance, they have a stranglehold on their victims. Their hosts then interpret the impulse to use drugs as entirely their own. Under the influence of the substance, they abdicate even more control over their lives. This permits the spirits, usually there are multiple possessions, to indulge to their heart's content. They don't have to pay the price in broken relationships, destroyed health, lost jobs, and even greater lowering of self-esteem and respect. The aura becomes very weakened from continued drug use, allowing easy possession by still others seeking a puppet, a pushover, or a sitting duck, as they have been described by their possessors. Because the original personality is overwhelmed by the addicted spirits, therapy is very difficult. The entities certainly aren't motivated to be helped. In their ignorance, they don't want to give up a good thing. Fortunately, in exceptional cases, I have been able to help some patients become freed from their enslavement, even in 1 or 2 sessions. Usually, however, it's a long struggle in which the patient often succumbs and drops out of treatment. This type of possession can be life-threatening, from a fatal overdose or car accident. Many of my patients have narrowly escaped death, as the following example illustrates. Glenn, a stockbroker in his mid-50s, sought help because he had suffered from severe insomnia for 20 years. Further conversation revealed a serious drinking problem that had developed suddenly 4 years before. After a few sessions, we uncovered an alcoholic entity, John, who had possessed him during a hospitalization 4 years ago. He apparently left with his loved one after an uncomplicated depossession. A few days later, Glenn called for an emergency appointment, urgently explaining to my secretary that he couldn't wait for his next scheduled treatment. As he walked into my office the next day, he looked terrible. After collapsing into the reclining chair, he blurted out, "I slept through the night for the first time in 20 years, the night of our appointment. But when I woke up in the morning, I felt sick. I could barely make it down to the kitchen to fix my coffee. My head was killing me. I couldn't believe it. There on the counter was the vodka, an entire liter empty. It was unopened the night before. I must have drank it all. There next to it was a whole quart of cottage cheese. Eaten, not a spoonful left. I really panicked. It's a wonder I wasn't dead. Thank God I ate the cottage cheese. And I don't remember a thing." Glenn continued, telling me that after that he had been confused and extremely depressed. He was terrified of seeing me again and immediately canceled his next appointment. Then he reflected and wondered if John had really left. He picked up the phone and asked to see me as soon as possible. Under hypnosis, it became clear that John had not gone into the afterlife, but had just left Glenn's aura temporarily. As he put it, I was found out and I felt closed in on. He admitted the depossession had profoundly upset him. It didn't take him long to slip back into Glenn's body. He was sleeping, but I wasn't. All I wanted was a drink. I was in a panic. I walked down to the kitchen and drank the vodka. Then I thought, I could kill us, so I ate the cottage cheese. After reassuring John, another depossession was tried. This time, I made sure he had a firm grip on his deceased wife's hand, and he finally left with her. It worked. Glenn lost all desire for vodka from that point on. Smoking addiction. Unlike drug abuse, nicotine addiction causes not as much weakening of the aura and no major distortion of consciousness. The effects are less destructive mentally and emotionally, but they take their toll on the individual's health. I've treated people who have complained of incipient emphysema or the threat of lung cancer, who have every reason to stop smoking, but can't. The addicted entities don't care a whit about the health of their hosts. They figure they can find another patsy if the host dies. What a relief it is to patients when the depossessions have been successful. They immediately find not only no desire to smoke, but freedom from withdrawal symptoms. Weight and obesity problems. One of the most multi-determined problems that therapists, medical and psychological, deal with daily is overweight or obesity, after surgery, the death of a loved one, etc. Sylvia, a delightful woman in her 40s, was overjoyed when her long-term obsessive craving for sweets, the bane of her chronic weight struggle, left after our first session during which I had performed a generalized depossession. At the beginning of our second meeting, she explained, "I have no interest at all in sweets. I can't believe it. You have no idea how it dominated my life. All I thought of was eating something sweet, and when I did, it didn't satisfy me. I had to exert all the control I could muster up, and I was like that as long as I can remember. Now I don't even think about it." Spirits bring their cravings with them. A craving for chocolate left with my patient's deceased father-in-law, who had been possessing her since his death. He was known to his family as a chocoholic. Another patient reported that the morning she seriously committed herself to start a diet, a voice in her head said, "I'm not going to let you do that. Forget it. I'm in charge." The possessing entity, which had dominated her for many years, departed only when convinced she could eat all she wanted in the spirit world. The compulsion to overeat vanished with her. Relationship problems. Relationships really suffer as a result of possession because there is an unsuspected ménage à trois or more involved. An unpleasant child may be harboring a vicious spirit whose values are different from those of the child's family. A husband could be relating to a male spirit possessing his wife. Interplay of the spirits involved between mates or partners often results in erratic sexual attraction. Even employee-employer relationships may be disturbed for the same reason, which is illustrated in the case study of Anne in Chapter 8. Sexual problems. Since many spirits were old when they died, the people they possessed often experienced symptoms of aging, including a noticeable diminution of their sexual drive. Sexual hang-ups are part of the repertoire many entities bring with them. Their own problems and proclivities manifest themselves when the possessed engage in sex. At one extreme, their hosts may even be prevented from approaching their partners. This was the case with Paolo, whom you will read about in chapter 11. One of the causes of homosexuality is possession by spirits of the opposite sex. If the possession began before puberty, heterosexual development often was disrupted, and the afflicted grew up believing they desired sexual partners of the same sex, when it was the entities who were determining their choices. Every homosexual patient I have done a depossession on has had at least one exceedingly dominating entity of the opposite sex who was determining the sexual preference. Often these patients told of feeling they were trapped in bodies of the wrong sex. Some of these people were considering irreversible transsexual operations because of the spirit's desperate attempt to make the possessee's body as much like the deceased one as possible. I have treated a number of transvestites, all with possessing spirits of the opposite sex. It was they who bought the clothes and dressed up to suit their fancy, much to the confusion and embarrassment of their victims. This chapter gives you an overview of how individuals' lives can be warped by possessing spirits. From the above categories and vignettes, you can see that the effects of possession can be disastrous and at times fatal. The next 5 chapters, each a complete case study, give an in-depth view of not only the devastating results of possession, but how it came about originally. You will be shown how depossession therapy benefited these suffering people, the possessed, as well as their possessors. These cases were picked from my files of hundreds of patients to give you an understanding of the anguish that ensues from possession, from the people themselves who were, in most cases, the consciously unwilling and unsuspecting victims of spirits.